Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 145 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Sobalski, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. When I started this podcast, I never imagined that I would be addressing a global audience under the threat of nuclear war, but here we are. So I apologize in advance for not really knowing how to do this. The situation unfolding in Ukraine is terrible beyond words. For those of us with the immense privilege of living far from the epicenter, it can be hard to know what to do that is helpful to the people in the midst of war. So before I start this episode, I thought I would give a historian's perspective on what we can do. The first thing I would say to you is to be very wary of propaganda. If a message is simplistic, scapegoating, and meant to stir your emotions, pay attention to the source and what it's asking you to do. We've all been manipulated at one time or another on the internet, and it's okay to admit it when it happens. In fact, admitting it is very helpful because it can show other people what to look for. The stakes are high right now, so do your best to verify your sources before you share something, especially if it's something that can escalate the situation or create panic. This is a very good time to pay attention, especially to the historians of World War II, who can tell us a lot about how propaganda is used in wartime. Secondly, if you can, donate to an international charity like Doctors Without Borders or UNICEF or whichever one you feel comfortable with. This is not the first conflict that they've faced, and sadly, the war in Ukraine isn't even the only conflict underway right now. Established international charities who deal with war and refugee crises understand what is needed, and they have the partnerships to acquire supplies and gain access to restricted zones. So donating to these charities can be the most efficient way to get people the help they need, no matter what that may be. If you can't help now financially, you can still follow these charities on social media and stay updated on what they need and how you can help. Finally, it's more important than ever to have compassion for others and for yourself. Compassion for others extends to helping internationally when you can, and locally only every day. It also extends to interactions with friends and strangers on the internet. We can never know what a person is dealing with, and it's safe to assume that after 2 years of a pandemic and escalating political tensions, everyone you meet is operating under stress and worry. Research has shown that we are nicer to the people we think are like us. So whether you're inline or online, look for those universally human qualities in other people and recognize that they are also doing their best. Self-compassion means you don't have to be plugged in 24/7 to show that you care. Contribute what you can, when you can, and keep yourself healthy so you can tap in when someone else needs to tap out. If you're emotionally burnt out, you won't be able to extend compassion to other people. So it's helpful to take care of yourself so that you can continue to be helpful over the long term. And the world needs you for the long term. As for this podcast, I'm going to continue on much as I have these past few pandemic years, since I think that is the best thing that I can contribute with the skills that I have. I'm not a doctor or an aid worker, so I can't do much that's concrete, but what I can give is history told through a compassionate lens and a bit of a respite from the present. With any luck, I can help you recharge your batteries and give you new perspectives to take with you into the present. So, on that note, it's time to do what I do best and introduce you to a stellar medievalist who can teach us a whole lot about a world long ago. This week, I had the pleasure of speaking with one of the most prolific and respected scholars in medieval studies, Renate Blumenfeld-Kosinski. Renate is a Distinguished Professor Emerita at the University of Pittsburgh and a former president of the Medieval Academy of America. In addition to dozens of articles and a whole bunch of edited books, she's the author of several of her own books, including Reading Myth, Classical Mythology and its Interpretations in Medieval French, Poets, Saints, and Visionaries of the Great Schism, 1378 to 1417, and The Strange Case of Ermine de Reims, or Ermine de Reims, a medieval woman between demons and saints. Our conversation on Hermine, demons, and the many ways in which medieval Christians could be tempted by demonic forces is coming up right after this. Well, thank you, Renate, for joining me to talk about Hermine de Reims. Now, this is a very exciting story, so I'm so happy to have you on the podcast.
Well, thanks for having me.
Okay, so this is somebody that I hadn't heard of before, and so I'm not sure how many people have actually heard of her. So can you tell us a little bit about who Hermine de Reims was?
Yeah, so she was, as some historians have said, an unknown woman in history. She was a simple peasant woman who was born just after the Great Plague. She died in 1396 at the age of 40-something. She was a farmer's wife. They had fallen on hard times, and her husband was much older. They moved to Reims, and she tried to make a living. So she was selling straw to make a living. She was then widowed, and she fell into the orbit of this Augustinian friar, Jean le Graveur. So why is she important? In the past, she was mentioned, very occasionally by historians, but always only in the context of the work of Jean Gerson, the famous chancellor of the University of Paris, and his work on the discernment of spirits. So I had seen her name. And then way back when I was working on my book on the Great Schism of the Western Church, I asked myself, did normal people even know about it? Did they care about it? And in that context, I came across the name of Ermine de Reims again, because strangely enough, she was extremely interested in this crisis, even though she was totally illiterate. So I started looking around, and I found that there had been a wonderful edition, actually made in 1997, of her so-called Revelations. So these chronicle the last 10 months of her life. So that's how I started working on her. I read the Revelations, and I was just blown away. I thought I must do more with her. And I was very moved. It's a very moving story.
Yes, it's very detailed. You get so much information there that you don't often get in saints' lives, like hagiography type stuff. So what happened to her that her story has been written down at all? What's her story?
Her story is one of horrific demonic attacks. The last 10 months of her life, she lived with, well, not with Jean le Graveur, but sort of in his orbit in a house with other people, actually, that looked out into the courtyard of these Augustinian friars. And she was haunted every night and sometimes during the day by horrific apparitions, animals, men in leathery outfits, snakes, toads, devilish women. In other words, what happened to her was a kind of haunting. It's not totally unique. What I tried to do in the book was really put her into context of other women who were haunted, especially Christina of Stommern, a German so-called mystic who died in 1312, who also had, hideous animals slithering into her bed and people accosting her in the street, attacking her. So in other words, she had these supernatural experiences. And clearly her confessor and confidant felt this was something that had to be written down. So that's what he did. And he did not write a saint's life because, she wasn't a saint, but he tried to construct something that would put her on the path to sainthood. And so what he did, he wrote a sort of what I call a logbook of her experiences, where he said, every morning I wrote down what Hermine told me had happened to her in the night. So it's really a unique genre. I have not been able to find any other text quite like that. It's not a diary by a holy woman. It's a witness statement that's taken every day. And the whole thing lasted only 10 months because poor Hermine then died of the plague. But these 10 months fill about 150 pages in the printed edition. So,
yeah, as you say, there's something happening every night. And I think in a lot of this saintly literature, you have people having visions where they see something. And Hermine has some of these visions as well, but she has a real physical connection with these demons. Like this is, well, so physical. They're actually hurting her as a person. So can you tell us a little bit more about what demons were like in the Middle Ages, how they're conceived of?
Yeah, they were certainly connected to the devil. Demons were taken for granted in medieval culture. And they were often sent by God, for example, to torment people and tempt them in order to show people steadfastness. And some of the things I read made the point that when real martyrdom was not possible anymore, when there were not sort of the Christian persecutions of the early church, very often demons sort of took over that function to torment people and test their steadfastness. They were thought to be in the air everywhere. They could manifest themselves as cold currents. They could manifest themselves. One of them is called an icicle lying in her bed. So the belief in demons was taken for granted. I mean, you can look in Thomas Aquinas, he talks about the functions of demons, but the existence was not doubted. And what's so interesting about Hermine's experiences is that they're not presented as visions. Jean de Graveur calls them aventures, right? In other words, things that happened to her, and they're reported in a completely realistic way. The door opened and a gigantic toad entered and slipped into her bed, right? And I looked a little bit of what are sort of the words that are used. For example, un homme, a man came in the door, right? It's not presented as a vision. Une chose, a thing, unidentified. Or the word that's often used is a satana, a Satan, right? Not that Satan. Mm-hmm. And what's the only constant about demons I read about in this wonderful book about Christina of Stommel is that they're shape changing. In other words, they can be your spouse, they can be your neighbor, they can be your pet dog. So in other words, they're completely shape changing. And you know, what's so interesting about the period of Hermine is that it's sort of on the cusp of the witchcraft, thinking about witchcraft, right? And I really struggled with that in the book to show that there is an older model of demonic attacks at work here, namely sort of the Saint Anthony in the desert, right? Who is also assailed by these sexy women and horrible animals. And so it's very much that model. Even though some demons take Hermine and take her on this aerial journey, you know, into the woods where she listens to a sermon of this very suspect former papal official, it's still not the witchcraft model, right? So I was going back to this famous canon episcopi, you know, the canon addressed to the bishops that supposedly dates from the 9th century, but it's later, where this canonist tried to persuade everyone who thought they had been transported by demons that it was just a delusion. But that did not stick. In other words, more and more people thought, oh, she was really taken by a demon, you know, or you sit backwards on a goat. Remember all that sort of from the witch crazes, right? But that develops more than in the 15th century. So in other words, I was trying to make the argument that she battles the demons in the old, valiant, saintly model, rather than being seduced by demons. She resists the demons, like when a young demonic couple comes into her bedroom and has sex right on the floor in front of her bed. She's not seduced, right? She's horrified.
Yeah, that must have been a bit of a surprise.
Indeed. And there are lots of remarks about fashion, what they're wearing. Yeah, these female demons are wearing these black dresses, you know, with push-up bras and deep necklines.
Well, that brings me to the question, what are the demons there for? What are they trying to accomplish at this time? Because I think that it's definitely right that you're saying this is an old model of demons. It's not the witchcraft model where they are trying to enlist witches or trying to seduce them or trying to possess them. What are the demons in Hermine's life trying to accomplish?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question because they have an agenda. And their agenda is to separate Hermine from her confessor. So everything they do is aimed at making her distrust her confessor and to separate herself and go back to her hometown. There is a conflict because after she's widowed, her friends from the country come and say, come back with us, Hermine, we'll take care of you. And I had been thinking about this, what is the situation of a widow at this time who is penniless? And, in the book, I have a whole section on sort of pensions and old age in the Middle Ages. There were very few options. Mm-hmm. So she moves into this orbit of this confessor, and the demons want her to leave him. And it's extremely interesting because he's the only one who wrote the text. I mean, he's the author, he's an actor and a witness in his own text. And so, I'm of course skeptical and suspicious when I read all this. And it seems to me to put into the demons' actions and into the mouth of demons, the efforts to separate her from him undercuts the whole thing. In other words, it's only a demonic suggestion. But it's horrible torture that they inflict on her, And recently, Barbara Newman has taken up Hermine in her wonderful new book, The Permeable Self. And she is even more skeptical than I am. She thinks, that he made her into a mad woman by his insane demands on her self-torture, and that all the wounds inflicted by the demons are actually self-mutilation. I didn't want to go that far in my own work because on purpose, I tried to look at the demons as demons in a 14th century setting. What were the limits, what people could believe about demons? And so in my preface, I was very much influenced by Oliver Sacks's book on hallucinations. And as I was reading that book, as I was working on the Hermine, I thought, yeah, this is exactly it. She has exactly the same hallucinations that modern people can have. Very often sort of on the borderline between waking and sleep, when you have sort of strange thoughts. And then I was thinking, should this be my framework? It was very tempting. and then I thought, no, I wanted to only look at her in terms of the late 14th century culture, And I don't know, that was my decision. And so I didn't go into psychoanalysis. Of course, these demons, they have sexual thoughts, they incarnate also the doubts about the Christian faith. That's one of their big functions, is to question the tenets of the Christian faith.
Yeah, you've brought up a whole bunch of things that I want to circle around back to. I'm like furiously writing notes. But one of the things that you've just mentioned, I think, is really important because I think even in the 14th century, people are thinking, is she real? Is she having a delusion? And what's interesting about the things that the demons say to her, and this is something that's pretty consistent, I think, in a lot of saints' lives or this type of story, is they're voicing these doubts about what Christian faith is like. So the host is just a piece of bread, honestly, or they're saying, this doesn't mean anything. You can't possibly save yourself. You might as well just sin. It doesn't matter. And so it's interesting to see these doubts being put in the mouths of demons, as you say, as something whispering in your ear instead of something that you own yourself. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So that the doubts come to life. Right. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is that she has these visions, and these are visions of the child and the host. I mean, that is one of the desired visions of pious people in the late Middle Ages. But interestingly, the very first time she has this vision is in a demonic mass celebrated by a fake saint, by a fake yes. Saint Augustine, who comes into her room with a little bell followed by angels and says, Hermine, I'm here for you. You don't even have to leave your bed. I'm going to celebrate mass for you right here in your bedroom. And that's when she sees the child in the host, that famous vision. But then later, as she gets closer to her death, we're then made to think by Jean le Graveur that as she walks in a procession on the street, in Reims, not at night in her bed, she again has a vision. And she has more and more, not just a child, but, like a 12-foot tall Christ in the host, right? So the visions then become sacred visions. But it's still so striking that the very first vision she has is in a demonic mass.
Mm-hmm.
And there are all these fake saints, right? All these counterfeit saints. I call them iconographically correct.
Yeah.
They walk into a room and they say, I'm St. Peter. I have that big key, or I'm the Magdalene. Look at my jar of ointment.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
This is my proof. So who is real and who isn't?
And it seems to be part of her devotion that she doesn't even believe Saint Peter. I think the real Saint Peter shows up, but she's not sure. And it's the fact that she doesn't trust him at all. That is also proof of her holiness as well.
Exactly. And, on the one hand, you might say, oh, poor Hermine, she was going nuts because she didn't know what to believe anymore, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then she is seen as a model, sort of performing discernment. She realizes when a fake saint comes in, but that also makes her distrust the one real saint when Paul le Simple comes in.
Mm-hmm.
Paul the Simple, not one of the best known saints in medieval France. A couple of times he's a demon, but at other times he's the real thing. And then she also wants to reject him when he comes as the real thing. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And all the time we're asking ourselves, of course, how did Jean-Luc Aver know all this?
Exactly.
Really just a record of what Hermine told him?
Mm-hmm. It's so complicated because there's a part where in the appendix you've added the visions so that we can read some of them for ourselves. And one of the things that you mentioned is she goes on and on about these visions that she has of the host over and over again. Every time she has communion, she has a vision of the host, to the point at which Jean is like, okay, I'm going to skip over these because, she's having too many visions. And you kind of wonder if at this point, is she just trying to please him? Like, is she really trying to find a vision every time she has communion just so she has something to please him with? Like, it's so complicated, their relationship.
That's an excellent question. In other words, was she really incited? What if she didn't have anything overnight and she would say to him, well, nothing happened this night, and he would be disappointed?
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And I mean, one of the things that we sort of discussed a little bit before, where you sent me a question, why did he do this? Why did he write this? Why didn't he just take care of her? Right?
Yeah.
That is an excellent question, because he could have just said, well, she's a penniless widow. And he makes very sure to say that he also met her husband, right? That he became a confessor to the couple, because so often these sort of holy couples get together, in ways that have maybe a slight sexual angle to them. But he says, no, I was a confessor to both of them. And then when he died, so why did he not just take care of her? And I'm thinking there was a large amount of religious institutions in Reims, right? There were all the mendicants were there. There were various Beguine communities. And I just feel that he wanted to do something special for his order, the Augustinians. And he wanted to create this holy woman that would gain traction. He wrote in French, right? So that's also important to mention. Even though, during that time, more and more was written in French, it was then translated very quickly into Latin by another friar. So there was sort of an effort maybe to start some sort of holy proceeding or something. Mm-hmm. But as I mentioned at the beginning, she's mostly known through the reaction of Jean Gerson, who in his very first treatise on the discernment of spirit mentions her and says, oh, she was a pious woman and she had a strong faith. Nonetheless, he says, let's not disseminate her text, to give people ideas maybe. Mm-hmm. And then about 20 years later, he completely changed his mind after the Council of Constance when he wrote another treatise on discernment. He said, I was almost seduced by the story of that woman. And, thank God I anything more about it. So in other words, the Augustinians, Jean Morel, the prior of Saint-Denis, they submitted this text to Gerson for vetting. And that might have been the first step in going further, maybe to declare her holy or something like that. Mm-hmm. but that never happened. So if he had only been her confessor, there wouldn't have been any profit for his order in just taking care of this disturbed woman, right?
Yeah. I think it's interesting because I think there's a common misconception that people had such blind faith in the Middle Ages. And I think that the fact that Jason is very hesitant, like, this is kind of excessive. This woman has more visions and experiences than anyone I've ever come across. I think that caution really speaks to the fact that people took faith so seriously, and people could be tricked and they didn't want to be tricked. They wanted to make sure that everything was by the book.
Exactly. And that's the whole purpose of this discernment of spirits, right? To have sort of this checklist of you have to be pious, you have to obey your confessor and so on. And, it's hard to know how people around her reacted to this. Her neighbors and friends are mentioned occasionally.
Mm-hmm.
She had this one friend who's named Marie de Banton, and she would ask her to come and help me with the laundry or something.
Mm-hmm.
But then, of course, it's a demon who comes instead and says, Marie wants you to help her with the laundry. And Hermine would say, no, but it's much too early. And then, of course, the little girl who came to ask turns into a stinking demon. So not even doing the laundry, is off limits. But aside from that, we don't really have any other testimony. It would be so intriguing to know about her screams, her attacks, furniture being broken, crockery being thrown around. Sometimes people would say, oh yeah, I heard something, or I saw a blue mark on her.
Mm-hmm.
But that's about it. In other words, no neighbor came around and said to Jean, what's going on? So that's a little disappointing, right? We have really only this one perspective.
Yeah, this is what happens when it's curated by somebody who has something invested in it. You can picture the neighbors around town kind of giving them the side eye. Like, you've moved her into an apartment? What? And you're visiting her every day in her bedroom? Okay.
Exactly. I'm sure there was gossip, right?
Yeah.
There must have been. I mean, she was in her mid-40s, which, even in the Middle Ages was not terribly old age. I mean, she was probably just post-menopause or something.
Mm-hmm.
And, there's a lot of sexual stuff in this text. And, every time a snake sort of slithers up someone's nightdress, you want to say, oh, Sigmund Freud, what do you think of that? But can you, right? I mean, that's the question.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sure there was gossip, as you say, and sexual sins are one of those things that people were so agonized about when they were holy people. This is one of the things that's really a fixation, I think. And it is for Hermine as well. She's always talking about her body. She hates it. And one of the things she does is tie a belt around it. Like, this is super shocking. What happens with her belt?
Yeah, so that's interesting. When I first read this, I thought that was unique.
Mm-hmm.
But it turns out it wasn't, because even Radegund, the holy Radegund in late antiquity or early Middle Ages did the same thing. But it's a horrific description. Mm-hmm. She ties the belt as some sort of penance, right, around her waist. And she keeps it on for such a long time that the flesh sort of grows over it. Mm-hmm. And when Jean le Graveur finally becomes aware of this, he said, you have to get rid of this, because there is this current of moderation that one finds, right, in late medieval asceticism, where very often the confessors would try to sort of tone down the totally crazy things, like Henry Suso, who puts on this hedgehog. He makes a vest out of a hedgehog, right? And where's that? So Jean says, you need to get rid of this. And so she says, well, I can't pull it out. So she puts a nail in the wall and she suspends sort of a rope, right? Ties that around it and then sort of throws herself on the ground so that it comes out with a lot of flesh attached. Mm-hmm. And we kind of think, ugh, how did she ever think of that? Mm-hmm. But then as we look in the hagiographic tradition, there are other examples of this. She was illiterate. And so anything that she did where we think there's a tradition attached to it, how would she have known about this, right?
Yeah. I mean, I suppose if she's speaking with Jean every day, she could be getting ideas from him. But I wanted to bring up that mortification because I think that's a huge part of the reason why Jasson was like, let's not tell people about this because we don't want people to mortify their flesh. So can you tell us just for a second about how widespread was this mortification of flesh? Because I do think that, again, there's kind of a modern misconception that everybody's just going around flagellating. So
Yeah.
it's getting,
No, I mean, those were extreme cases. I mean, these were mostly women, but also men, like Suso, for example. And also, I talk a little bit in the book about Arnold of Villiers, a lay brother from modern day Belgium. But these were people who had an ambition to become holy through this kind of mortification. They were seen as outliers. And I worked a lot on Christina of Stommel, that German mystic in the early 14th century. And you can see that people thought she was crazy, right? And this wonderful book by Aviat Kleinberg, Prophets in Their Own Country, he looks a lot at what factors induce people to see someone as holy or not holy when they do the exact same thing, right? So in other words, one woman might be considered holy because she's mortifying herself with the blood flowing, and another might be considered crazy. And it depends very much on community support, on the framework that these women lived in. But I should say, we know about the people who did it, but we don't know about the millions who didn't. So in other words, I don't think it was, a common practice to mortify yourself to the blood, but we know about those who did, and especially those that had aspirations to holiness and who felt that this kind of imitation of the martyrs almost, and an imitation of Christ, of course, Christ suffering on the cross and Christ's blood, that this was one element that you absolutely needed to be holy, right? I mean, others were perfectly happy to be just charitable, or,
Yeah.
you'd cut off half your cloak and you're a saint. So it was certainly a feature of late medieval devotion, but not one that was super common, right?
Thank you for saying that on the record because, yeah, I think that it needs to be said. And I think that's something that, again, Jean is trying to establish in his record because he says Hermine wants to fast all the time. And I keep telling her not to fast all the time, or I keep telling her to be nicer to her body or rest if she's sick. And that seems to be something that he's making his own case for. I'm not influencing her to be a saint in these ways. I'm trying to tell her to be moderate, and still these things are happening.
Yeah, I mean, she must have a kind of internalized a model, of this extreme persecution. And it's not just a question of class, because an almost contemporary, somewhat later, Francesca Romana, who also comes up in the book, she was of wealthy Roman family. She has very similar experiences. And then also later, the person I'm working on right now, Saint Colette of Corbie, she also has demons come into her cell. They bring corpses taken down from the gallows and lay them out in her cell. They break her furniture. They torment her in the shape of horrible animals. So now we're already sort of in the mid-15th century. And yet with the sainthood model, even with Colette, again, there is not yet the witchcraft model that comes in, right? Even though that's just 30 years before the Malleus, the Hammer of Witches, is composed. In other words, the torments inflicted by those demons are very, very consistent, really, over quite a few centuries.
I think you're right. I realized that I didn't ask, and maybe this is a good question to ask. How do you get rid of demons if they appear in your bedroom? How do you get rid of them?
Well, if you're a sort of a budding saint like Saint Colette, she makes the sign of the cross, okay? And that often helps. What Hermine tries to do And this is a very funny scene. Actually, she has a tablet that shows the Arma Christi, sort of devotional tablet, the Arma Christi, the nails and the crown of thorns and the spear. And she has it. And she knows that if she could only get to it and brandish it, they would probably leave. But it's in a trunk, right? She tries to get it out of the trunk. As she tries to get it, she falls over backwards. She falls down the stairs. But then when she finally gets it out, that works. Mm-hmm. But, this is actually such an interesting question. It doesn't always work. And she just has to wait it out, because often she says, va-t'en, Satana, get out of here. And it doesn't work. Mm-hmm. So in other words, there is no exorcism that works. And interestingly, there is no attempt at exorcising her ever, because she's not seen as possessed by demons, right? She's seen as tormented by demons. And I think that exorcism is much more used if someone is possessed, seen as possessed. She's not seen as possessed, which I think strikes us as very odd. If they had just done an exorcism and the demons could just go up in a puff of smoke and be gone. That is not what's happening here. There's not one moment when Jean says, oh, let's just all get together and do an exorcism.
It's a good point because, she must have endless supplies of holy water because she's sprinkling everything. As you say, it doesn't work. But there doesn't seem to be a time where anyone says, I'll sit up with you and wait for the demons to come, or I'll move you to a different room, or nothing like that. Like, it almost seems exploitative because they don't try to stop the problem,
Yeah, that's an excellent point. In other words, she's being tormented, but nobody suggests any particular means to stop it. I mean, very often, like, again, sort of in the life of Saint Colette, a demon might assail her, but then her co-sisters who are right with her don't see the demons. Mm-hmm. They say, oh, we can't see them because she's the holy person who can see them. But Colette is a Franciscan. I mean, she's a nun, right? A great reformer. So she lives in a religious milieu, whereas Hermine, she can barely say the Paternoster. So she doesn't have any sort of models to draw on. But, I think your point is excellent. She's really sort of left alone with this. She reports about it. But, the only thing that Jean sort of does practically, he gives her a fly swatter when she is assailed by these enormous demonic flies, and he brings in a little sachet of lavender, right? Mm-hmm. when the demonic stink fills the bedroom. I mean, that's not much help, really.
No. It's like, it's addressing the symptom, I suppose, but not the problem. So I'm wondering if you think that maybe this has to do with the fact that sometimes demons can be sent by God, as you say, to test. So I'm wondering, do you think it's because they thought, or Jean thought, maybe I shouldn't stop this. Maybe this is divinely sent. Do you think that might have factored into it? Or you think maybe he was kind of out for himself?
Well, he doesn't say that explicitly, but I think he might have thought that way. In other words, these endless tests, because he keeps on saying how strong she is. She's fortified by her faith, and therefore she never gives in to the temptations, whatever of a sexual nature or what they might have been. She's also tempted by money, and that's actually an interesting little episode when she's out in the woods there, listening to this heretical former papal official. Demons come with sacks of money and say, we could just give you this money if you will follow us. Mm-hmm. And she rejects it. Once I gave a talk at Kalamazoo, which was called Sacks of Money or a Paycheck, ? Because there were these two temptations. The demons also tempted her and said, just leave and get a job. Mm-hmm. Why are you stuck with this confessor? You could become, laundress or go back to selling straw, whatever. Just become independent, go on a pilgrimage, separate yourself from him. But she won't, right? Yeah. Because it's the demons suggesting it. So in other words, the temptation of money plays a big role also in later witchcraft trials, where
Yeah.
demons come with sacks of money and so on. But there again, it's not made into a motif of the witchcraft trials, right? But just as something she rejects.
Yeah, this is around the same point in the story where she has friends again saying, just come home. Just come home and we'll take care of you. And she sees them as demons. And I guess we're seeing this through Jean's perspective as well. He sees them as demons. Well, of course he would.
Right. Exactly. And even her late husband appears as a demon. So just proving that anyone can be a demon. And even Jean le Graveur is impersonated by a demon at some point, interestingly. Yeah. So there's just no telling what's what.
I think that's so important. I'm so glad you came on to tell us about demons because, as you say, they're such a fixture of medieval life and mentality. So thank you so much for coming on and telling us all about demons. I really appreciate it.
Well, it was great fun. Thanks for suggesting a talk about Hermine, no longer unknown.
No longer unknown, especially not after this. Thanks so much. To find out more about Renate's work, you can visit her academia.edu page at independent.academia.edu/Renate Blumenfeld-Kosinski. Her book is The Strange Case of Ermine de Reims, a medieval woman between demons and saints, and her forthcoming book is Two Lives of Saint Colette. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's new this week, Peter?
Hey, so I've got some big news to say. I've been working on medievalist.net for about 13, 14 years, but for the last 6, I've also been the editor of Medieval Warfare magazine. And it just happens that I've stepped down as the editor for the basic reason is medievalist.net has been keeping me too busy. So thanks to all my wonderful writers, all the podcasters, you and our readers who have been supporting us, especially on Patreon, I've been able to just focus now on medievalist.net. So this is kind of an exciting time for our site, for our media company. And I just wanted to thank you all the listeners for your support. And also I want to thank, the publishers of Medieval Warfare magazines called Karu & Sari. Jasper has been a wonderful person to let me be the editor for the magazine, do all these issues. I'm excited where the magazine is going. We have the new editor there, Alice Sullivan, and the magazine is going to get a lot better under her reign. So I'm very excited about that. I'm not stepping away entirely. I'm even writing in the next issue. So I'm really excited to share that news. But for the people here listening, just medievalist.net, you're going to see some a nice expansion. I think I'll be able to put my full efforts towards it to make it bigger and better for everybody.
Well, congratulations, Peter. I know it's a bit of a heartbreak to step away from Medieval Warfare magazine because you've really spent a lot of good time and work there and really built it into something that you could be proud of. But congratulations to you because I know medievalist.net is your baby, something that you invented along with Sandra Alvarez, and now you are at the helm. Congratulations to you to have it be your one and only now. That's wonderful.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. It's, I'm excited, a little bit scared, but really, really happy and loving what I do. And I hope all the listeners have the same with what they're doing too as well. So.
Well, it's great when you are creating something on your own and when you finally get to that point where you can let go of the branch and and fully pour yourself into your passion project. So I know that I'm wishing you the best, and I'm sure everyone else who's listening is too.
Thanks so much.
Do you have stuff to tell us about what's on the website this week?
Indeed. From our ongoing Power of the Text series, we have How to Promote Your Patron Saint.
I love it.
And we have another classic medieval movie review. It's El Cid, the old Charlton Heston film is very interesting on multiple ways, on camera and especially off. So you can read the in-depth stuff on that. Plus, I've got a ton of contributors and writers that I know I have to get to. They're bringing in their great stuff. So I'm hoping you're going to kind of see going forward pieces every day, new pieces on medievalist.net.
Well, that's exciting. Thanks so much, Peter. And congratulations again. This is a big step for you, and we're all behind you.
Thanks.
Thank you to everyone who came to my virtual book launch with Helen Castor last Friday. We had a great time talking about the book, about monks, and about wellness today. If you're interested in catching the replay, you can find it on my social media pages at 5MIN Medievalist. Thank you also to everyone who supports the Medieval Podcast and Medievalist.net's other work on Patreon. In addition to ad-free options for this podcast and for the website, there's plenty of other awesome stuff for patrons like subscriptions to Medieval Warfare Magazine and the Medieval Magazine, a book club, and exclusive maps by Tina Ross. To find out how to lend your support, please visit patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from demons to dogs' names, follow medievalist.net on Facebook or Twitter at medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cebulski, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5 Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can even get hold of How to Live Like a Monk, Medieval Wisdom for Modern Life, in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Guy Frog. Thanks for listening, and take good care of yourselves.